Hello and welcome to the Delphi survey for the COrSIcA study. I'm David Finch, a trainee colorectal surgeon based in the United Kingdom. I'm also project lead for COrSIcA, which I'm undertaking as part of my PhD through the University of Manchester. In this first video, I'll detail the background to the study, why we are doing the research, how the research is done, and how this research will benefit the anal H-cell community. The second video will detail how to complete the survey and what happens after you complete the survey. The results of the survey will be used to help determine a core outcome set for use in future late-phase treatment trials that determine how well different treatments for anal HSIL work and how safe they are. A core outcome set is a list of treatment effects, which by researchers are termed outcomes, that are deemed so important that they should be measured and reported in all studies investigating treatments for a particular condition. To clarify, early phase trials are research studies that typically establish whether a particular treatment is safe for human use, dosages, and determine whether or not that particular treatment works. Once early phase trials are complete, late phase trials are used to test the treatment against other treatments to determine which treatment works best and/or is most safe. Core outcome sets are incredibly useful. To understand why, we need to understand how healthcare treatments are developed. To help patients, doctors, and other health professionals make decisions about treatments, we need evidence about what works best. Researchers test treatments to make sure they work and are safe. To do this, researchers need to look at the effects those treatments have on patients. Researchers do this by measuring an outcome. For example, in a study of how well a new cancer treatment works, outcomes might include a measure of how long or whether a person lives, which in short is known as survival. Another example might be whether or not a cancer comes back after it's cured, which might be termed disease recurrence. There are, however, a number of challenges when it comes to outcomes that are measured in treatment studies for a particular condition. At the moment, different studies looking at treatments for the same condition often measure different outcomes. For instance, imagine two studies of how to treat migraine. In study A, researchers measure days off sick as an outcome, whereas in study B, researchers measure symptoms of pain as an outcome. When the two studies are finished, we cannot compare or combine the results because they've used different outcomes. We would not be comparing like with like. This is very much the case for anal HSIL treatment studies to date. Another problem is when a study team set out to collect information on several outcomes, but in the end decide to publish the results on only some of the outcomes they measured. This sometimes happens when the findings for particular outcomes differ from those findings that the team had hoped for. In this situation, researchers can struggle to work out exactly how well a treatment works because they don't have the full results from the study, and the information they do have might be biased. So how can we solve this problem? Well, if all studies in a particular health condition measure the same outcomes, they could all be compared and combined. This would also reduce waste by making the best use of all the research. When a set of main outcomes has been agreed for a health condition, it's called a core outcome set. If all studies in a particular condition, such as migraine, then measured and reported these outcomes, we could bring together all the studies to get a better understanding of which treatments are best and avoid the problem of some studies only reporting a selection of the outcomes that they measured. There are several treatments available for anal HSIL. By determining a core outcome set for use in future late phase treatment trials testing anal HSIL treatments, we can help to ensure that the outcomes reported in future anal HSIL treatment trials are consistent and meaningful, and ultimately get a better understanding of which treatments are best. Deciding which outcomes should be core requires a great deal of discussion. Core outcomes have to be relevant to those that the research affects, for instance, the patients that undergo the treatment and the health professionals administering the treatments. People working on core outcome sets need to make sure that this expertise from patients and professionals is used to agree on the core outcomes. To do this, they often use consensus methods. To achieve consensus in COrSIcA, and therefore agreement on which treatment effects or outcomes are most important to be measured in future trials testing anal HL treatments, a type of survey called a Delphi survey is being used. In a Delphi survey, participants are asked to take a survey and then retake the same survey after a period of time, but this second time with feedback on how other participants scored each of the questions. This approach ensures that participants have had a good opportunity to consider the reasoning for their choice of answer and be sure about the choices that they've made. The Delphi survey is then followed by a meeting to discuss the survey results and then vote on any outcomes that the Delphi survey was unsure about. The Delphi survey and consensus meeting is open to both patients and professionals. Core outcome sets need to include outcomes that are relevant to patients, and the best way to do this is to involve patients in their development. There are examples of how involving patients identified an outcome that was important to them as a group, but which might have been overlooked if practitioners have done the work on their own. When a core outcome set has been agreed, the hope is that researchers will use it in all studies for a particular condition, adding in other outcomes where necessary, for example, outcomes specific to a particular treatment or subgroup of the population. Importantly, just because an outcome doesn't make it into the core outcome set, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be measured in future studies. It just means that it hasn't been considered of critical importance that it should be measured routinely in all studies. It's perfectly acceptable for a researcher to include any outcomes that didn't make it into the core outcome set in their research study. That concludes the first video. Please click on video 2 to hear about how to complete the survey.